ultimately, there is no duty to love God, an uncomfortable but necessary truth. Bruce Charlton. The developments of human consciousness over the past 2,000 years have exposed what are often experienced as some uncomfortable truths about the Christian's ultimate relationship to God. At the time of Christ, men did not experience themselves as fully differentiated individuals. Life was, to a significant, often large, extent, experienced as a group member. And society was organized in the same way. Men were classified by nation, tribe, caste, occupation, family membership, etc. These relationships were mandatory and governed by duties on both sides. Duty was, indeed, a foundational virtue in such societies. The existentialist feeling, first articulated specifically in the early 21st century by Heidegger, of experiencing oneself as having been thrown into this world, without consent, seems to have been almost entirely absent. Men came to consciousness already belonging in the world, in their situation, and accepting the duties thereof. Duty was necessary, or, at least, expedient, because in a society thus organized, those who shirked their duties were coercively transferring responsibilities onto other men's shoulders. The undutiful were parasitizing on the group, and thereby benefiting, perhaps thriving, at the expense of the dutiful. This leeching behavior could not be allowed to expand beyond some small size, or else the group would inevitably be destroyed. In such societies, the Christian religion, like other religions, was often treated as a matter of group membership. In Anglo-Saxon or Viking England, when the king became Christian, it was felt to be natural and inevitable that all his subjects underwent mass baptism, and believed. Just as the warrior or peasant was bound to his lord by bonds of mandatory duty, a duty which he would often embrace as his primary ethic, so he experienced the same kind of relationship with God. But over the past centuries, men's minds have changed. Modern man's consciousness just is extremely different. Men can, and often do, differentiate themselves from whatever group of which they find themselves members, or choose some other group with which to affiliate. Furthermore, especially in the West, but to some degree everywhere, there is little or no sense of duty in such relationships, and little reciprocity felt on either side. This decline of inner duty has, in practice, had many deleterious effects, and will probably contribute to the destruction of Western civilization. Yet, as the other side of the same coin, these Western societies only exist and used to thrive, as a consequence of the same changes in human consciousness away from the group and towards individuality, that are now destroying them. But, to understand this ancient mindset requires that, although we now know that duty and love can be separated, and indeed just are separated, for these men of the past, the two quite naturally went together. This happened then in much the same way as it does even nowadays for most young children in close families. The young child conflates love of parents with duty to parents. And the mother and father does the same with each child. Thus a loving mother of a baby would say it is her duty to feed and care for the child, but also she wants to do so, and, so long as love is constant, does not need to be coerced by a sense of duty. A loving mother would be annoyed and insulted if her care for her baby was assumed to be motivated by fear of laws, or a sense of duty to the state. In other words, love transcends duty. And this is the core of the lesson for Christians. Love renders duty unnecessary, and indeed reveals duty to be an alien intrusion. And therein lies the rub. In practice, some mothers do not love their babies, and then her proper care may be imposed from externally, made a matter of enforced duty. And even the most loving of mothers, someone who has, insofar as this is possible, made as strong a commitment to love their child as she is capable of making, may find that there are times and situations when that love wavers, and then a sense of duty may be needed to step in temporarily until love resumes. Yet to place duty as the primary motivator for child care instead of love, on the basis that in this mortal life love cannot always be relied upon, is at best, and even when genuinely motivated for children's best interests, which is apparently very seldom to judge by the high rates of child neglect, abuse and exploitation in institutions, a social expedient. An expedient needed in this mortal life where sin contends with virtue, but far from ideal. Certainly duty is not the ideal basis for the best child care. We can easily imagine, and probably have experienced, a much better basis, namely love. And this is why Christians should not, nowadays, discuss God in terms of duty. To the modern consciousness, this gives an utterly false picture of the desired nature of the relationship between God and each man. This relationship between God and man is ideally one of mutual love. On the side of God it is already one of constant and eternal love, and it is for each man to choose whether or not he desires to return that love, to make love mutual. But, the tough truth is that love cannot be coerced, it must be given, over and again, moment by moment, and lower values such as duty, obligation, or avoidance of guilt, or expediency, should not be the basis of that love. And Christians should not urge them either, because that is to devalue our relationship with God. The same choice comes to all modern adolescents. After natural development, aided by social corruption, takes them to a point of detachment from parents, often a degree of hostility, the adolescents or young adults must choose whether or not to love their mothers and fathers. While dutiful behavior can be externally imposed, to some degree, on adolescents and adults, and while they can be psychologically manipulated by playing upon negative feelings of duty, guilt etc., we readily recognize that this is ultimately counterproductive. Unless love is freely given from a positive impulse, from the depths of oneself, and by choice, it is just some kind of expediency, and not Christian. And yet, at the same time, we recognize that in this mortal world of change, decay, death and evil, we cannot rely on love to be continuously active. We cannot be sure to hold to eternal commitments in this mortal life. We may be fooled by cunning evil propaganda, warped by social pressures that we are too weak to withstand, become diseased, or broken by life. Many adverse possibilities may supervene. We can decide what we want here and now, but only make eternal commitments in and for the life to come after death. It was part of the gift of Jesus Christ to make this possible. He made it possible for us to choose the ideal of love, and by resurrection to enter a situation where all is regulated by love, because love is eternally mutual among all who dwell therein, and that love is unopposed by sin, by death, or by expediency. For such reasons, it seems to me that modern Christians should clarify their own understanding of this existential reality of the gratuitousness of love, and also grasp that while love may be our ideal in this mortal world, love can be, but can only be, full and everlasting in the resurrected life beyond death, in heaven. And that is a world that has transcended duty. The hope, not mine, of a divine negentropic/alchemical redemption of this mortal life and world. Bruce Charlton. As I have previously said, from reading the fourth gospel as well as the core sense of Christianity, I do not believe that Jesus Christ promised a second coming. On the contrary, I believe Jesus fully achieved everything he incarnated to achieve in a cosmological sense, in terms of changing reality, and that since ascension his role is to guide all who ask for his help, by the Holy Ghost. But a familiar worldly messianic project of redemption of this sinful and suffering mortal life, of Jesus returning to take up kingship of a new and purified this world, seems to have been introduced into Christianity at an early stage, and continues. For such redemption to happen, this world would need to be remade, in such a way that all that is evil and of sin, including death, would be removed, purified, transformed, and only good remain. This might be envisaged to happen all at once at the second coming, but there have always, I think, been some who saw this happening gradually, incrementally, a bit at a time. I first understood this in listening to lectures by Stanley Messenger in which he expounded the ideas of Rudolf Steiner. In this explanation, the spilled blood of the crucified Christ entered the substance of the being that is planet Earth, and initiated a process of transformation that could be explained in terms of alchemy and homeopathy, and would lead eventually to the total redemption of Earth and everything that dwells here. In the end, as I understand it, there would be a complete integration of all, into full accord with divine purposes. I have also come across what seems to me a variation of this basic idea in Philip K. Dick's exegesis, where he is discussing Jacob Boehmer and Anne Whitehead. PKD's version is that this reality began as dominated by chaos, and continues as entropy. God began creation in this context, and there has since been a process by which creation gradually overtook chaos, in which negentropy incrementally overwhelms entropy. Until either at or by the second coming, the process is completed and all that is evil, destructive, all suffering and pain, is transformed into goodness and happiness. My above summaries are themselves of secondary sources, thus unreliable as to detail, but I offer them as the kind of thing that would need to happen if this mortal world were to be saved, redeemed, made into heaven on earth. In other words, all that is evil, all destructive change, all death, would need to be transformed into harmony with divine creation. And this transformation is regarded as something that will happen. It is not a matter of choice, but of processes acting irresistibly upon beings. Evil and sin are eliminated by being made good. Now, I regard this as both impossible, because evil cannot be made good, and undesirable to Christians, because salvation must be chosen. More fundamentally, I do not believe that this is what will happen. I think it is a mistake to suppose that Jesus said he would make heaven on earth, or by processes incrementally to transform mortal to immortal life. The real situation is much simpler, which is that evil and sin will not because cannot be eliminated in this world and mortal life, which is why we must die and be resurrected to enter the state of only goodness, we must be born again. Those, and only those, who choose resurrection, and allow/embrace the necessary transformative changes to themselves, will be added to heaven, will join heavenly life, leaving behind their sins and all evil, and from thence, living only by love. This mortal realm with its sins and evil will be left behind, as a place for those who choose to hold their sins and evil, and those who choose not to live wholly by love. Such must happen, in order that heaven be possible, and it must happen because eternal beings must dwell somewhere. And if beings do not want to dwell in heaven, then they will remain in some part or variant of the mixed world of this world of mortality, where entropy and creation contend. Reading the fourth Gospel in the way it was meant to be read. Bruce Charlton. As I have mentioned several times, I am engaged on an intense, poetic reading of the fourth Gospel, John's, in which I read with the assumptions that this is the primary and most valid communication concerning Jesus. Why? Because the author of this Gospel is the beloved disciple who is Lazarus, raised, who is the brother of Mary of Bethany, who is the same person as Mary Magdalene, who is the wife of Jesus, them having married initially in a normal Jewish way in Cana, and then in some heavenly and eternal fashion in Bethany, the episode of the spikenard ointment. The author of the fourth Gospel was therefore Jesus' best friend, an ex-disciple of John the Baptist, who had an essential role in the ministry of Jesus, Jesus' brother-in-law on earth and eternally, and himself an eternal being, the first resurrected man. The primary validity of such a source is self-evident. My assumption is that at the time of writing of the fourth Gospel, its readers will all have known the identity of the author, his nature, and his close and unique relationship with Jesus. This is therefore taken for granted in the text, and the text makes perfect sense in light of such knowledge. This is certainly not an arcane, secret, occult, or Gnostic interpretation of the fourth gospel. Quite the opposite. The fourth gospel was and is perfectly clear, its message was and is on the surface and not hidden between the lines. Its message is available to all and not restricted to the initiated. The fourth gospel is simply the story of Jesus written by such a man as Lazarus was known to be, as clear as possible given the nature of the material, and in the poetic way that such matters were written, at that time and in that place. By poetic reading, I mean that I am reading in a manner that empathizes with the consciousness of the author and era, and therefore regards the language as poetry not prose. Naturally, I am reading and rereading the King James's /authorized translation of the Gospel, as being the only divinely inspired English version. And the KJB is poetic, indeed it is one of the greatest works of literature in its language, or any language. Since poetic language, like all ancient language, is poetic, it cannot be translated word by word, nor concept by concept. Ancient languages meant many things at once in ways that are now impossible to express, except by more poetry, and poetry is currently extinct, or all but. The nearest, which is not very near, is a list of semi-synonyms based on etymology, from which a jump of sympathy, empathy, identification may be helped. Furthermore, my understanding is that because the fourth gospel is by far the most valid and important part of the Bible, to understand Jesus and his work and message I need initially to understand it from the fourth gospel alone, without the endless distractions and misleading tendencies of attempting to triangulate other and less valid New and Old Testament sources. In other words, if I can attain clarity of the correct issues from the fourth gospel, regarded as valid, then this understand may then be applied to the other parts of the Bible, and indeed other sources. Note, the method of the fourth gospel seems to be in working through great sweeps of text which clarify, by approaching a question or point from many angles, and aiming to remove ambiguities or incomprehension. It seems necessary to read, therefore, at sufficient length to notice these convergences. It is proving to be an astonishingly rich experience, yielding wave after wave of clarification and insight. Most important is the essence of what Jesus offers, that he variously calls by terms such as the word meaning thought, making, creation, life, light. So that life is the key word / concept, and everlasting life is the main thing that Jesus brings or offers. Everlasting life, and light, is everlasting creativity, generation, it is thus more like biology, with development and growth, than it is like physics. Therefore, what Jesus offers us is something in time, it is active, dynamic, changing as living entities, it is not a blueprint for some final static state. And he offers this on the basis that we believe him, that is we trust him, have faith and confidence in him, love and esteem him, ally with him, and in doing so we ally with the primary creator who is Jesus' Father, with whom Jesus is in complete accord and whose mission he is fulfilling. It really does seem that simple, and that complex. Jesus offers everlasting life, which is a situation arrived at via death and by bodily resurrection, by means of our attitude to the person of Jesus. Simple, but there are many passages in which, by his attitude and teachings, Jesus is clear that many or most people will not want to take up his offer of everlasting life, for various reasons. It seems that it is a mistake to try and persuade people that they want everlasting life. Jesus works by trying to make clear the situation, and the nature of what he offers, what he brings. He explains things in several ways with parables, and sayings with miracles, and with analogies. Sometimes Jesus answers direct questions, but often there comes a point when he refuses to say any more to people, when he realizes that they understand and know but reject his gift. In effect, you asked me, I told you. You will not accept my answer, yet you ask me again. I am not going to repeat myself. You ask for evidence, I give you evidence. You will not accept the evidence, yet you ask for more evidence. My distinct impression is that Jesus did not expect his offer to be taken up by everybody. He anticipated that everlasting life would be rejected by many people. Belief in Jesus is clearly something conceptually simple, albeit that concepts such as belief were then far more complex / multivalent / symbolic than they are now, and potentially instantaneous. But this was when Jesus was physically present on earth in his mortal, or resurrected, life, and therefore his influence was spatially limited. Jesus explains to his disciples that this limitation will be overcome after he ascends to his Father, when he will send the Holy Ghost or Comforter, who will be an improvement on the physical presence of Jesus. We moderns find this hard to believe, but Jesus was quite definite: it is better to have the Holy Ghost than the physical presence of Jesus. Because the Holy Ghost provides what Jesus did, but universally and from within each person. Jesus makes clear that the Holy Ghost is in fact himself. The Holy Ghost is our direct and personal contact and communication with the ascended Jesus, that, without any other source, potentially provides every person with knowledge and guidance sufficient for eternal life. Sometimes Jesus is talking to and about the disciples as a specific group. It was clearly of great importance that the disciples be a coherent and loving group after Jesus had ascended. At other times he seems to be referring to everybody alive and hereafter. But, rather than the work of the disciples and their descendants, I think the fourth gospel is telling us that the core method of Christianity is the direct contact with Jesus himself, in his universal form as the Holy Ghost / Comforter. Much more can, and I hope will, be said on these matters. From a wall of noise to a wall of silence. Francis Berger. In a post from last March, I noted the following. Any communication from the system is manipulation, not communication. Analyzing the manipulation as manipulation is one way to determine what is going on. Another way to examine system manipulation is to focus on what the system is not talking about or broadcasting. This is particularly relevant when it pertains to certain themes that the system had previously obsessed over but then, suddenly and mysteriously, no longer talks about or broadcasts. System noise is manipulation containing mostly lies. Conversely, system silence tends to communicate a great deal. The Birdemic was a theme the system obsessed over for nearly 3 years. Now, suddenly and mysteriously, it no longer talks or broadcasts anything about it. Sure, there is the odd story here and there, and the occasional ominous report about the next round of PECs or a new bug showing up on the radar or the complex and all-encompassing biometric apparatus some world organization and governments are quietly working on implementing, but it all pales in comparison to the all-consuming caterwauling we had to endure for over 2 years. One thing is irrefutable: the system has more or less distanced itself from the Birdemic and is now conspicuously uninvolved it, at least as far as its communication, manipulation goes. Many chalk this up to the splintering of the hegemonic global cooperation brought about by the outbreak of the war. I believe there is much to be said for that, but something tells me there is more at play. Be that as it may, my notions of what this something might be are hazy at best. I know the system is no longer talking about the Birdemic. I also know this silence is meaningful, yet I can't determine what this meaning might be. Thoughts? For interacting abstract tendencies or forces, or else one being, why I found it necessary to revise the polar metaphysics of Coleridge / Barfield / Arkle. Bruce Charlton.
The transcendental philosopher says, "Grant me a nature having two contrary forces, the one of which tends to expand infinitely, while the other strives to apprehend or find itself in this infinity, and I will cause the world of intelligences with the whole system of their representations to rise up before you. Every other science presupposes intelligence as already existing and complete. The philosopher contemplates it in its growth, and as it were represents its history to the mind from its birth to its maturity. It is equally clear that two equal forces acting in opposite directions, both being finite and each distinguished from the other by its direction only, must neutralize or reduce each other to inaction. Now the transcendental philosophy demands, first, that two forces should be conceived which counteract each other by their essential nature, not only not in consequence of the accidental direction of each, but as prior to all direction, nay, as the primary forces from which the conditions of all possible directions are derivative and deducible. Secondly, that these forces should be assumed to be both alike infinite, both alike indestructible. The problem will then be to discover the result or product of two such forces, as distinguished from the result of those forces which are finite, and derive their difference solely from the circumstance of their direction. When we have formed a scheme or outline of these two different kinds of force, and of their different results, by the process of discursive reasoning, it will then remain for us to elevate the thesis from notional to actual, by contemplating intuitively this one power with its two inherent indestructible yet counteracting forces, and the results or generations to which their interpenetration gives existence, in the living principle and in the process of our own self-consciousness.
From Biographia Literaria by ST Coleridge, 1817. The above passage has stood for over 200 years as the basis of a polar metaphysics that has underpinned several of the most valid and coherent metaphysical explanations of a romanticism compatible with Christianity. These include the work of Owen Barfield, especially as elucidated in his book What Coleridge Thought, and William Arkle, appearing as contrasting feminine and masculine poles, geometrically or by analogy with physics described in A Geography of Consciousness, and the Hologram and Mind. Although these two contrary forces can indeed be the basis of a coherent and valuable metaphysics, as Coleridge immediately makes apparent, it is also necessary to add further assumptions, such as that these forces are infinite and indestructible, in other words, eternally self-originating and self-sustaining. It is also necessary to add at least a further two similar factors, namely purpose and time, because to explain the phenomena of this world it is necessary to explain change, and necessary too to explain the direction, teleology, of change. Put together, these are the basis of Coleridge's polar metaphysics/polarity/polar logic, which was his fundamental and most original philosophical idea, an idea never popular, seldom well understood, yet nonetheless always retaining influence. Note: it should be noticed that Coleridge's polarity is almost the opposite of what modern people mean by polarization. So, we get what amounts to a complex, abstract, dynamic, and difficult to conceptualize, explanatory scheme, with at least four elements. Moreover, polarity, a model of reality that does not arise from common sense, and is utterly incomprehensible to children, or simple people, or those incapable of or unwilling to make sustained and concentrated effort. Thus, having grappled with polar metaphysics until I felt I did understand it, I still found it very difficult to explain, such that it was difficult to be sure I had genuinely understood it, or indeed that other people had understood it. Furthermore, given that polarity/polar logic was associated by Coleridge by the idea of an animated universe, a reality in which nothing was dead or mineral, and instead everything was alive, conscious, purposive. Given this, the metaphysics of polarity led to the strange and wrong-seeming necessity to explain organisms and other actual, concrete and experienced living beings, in terms of these abstract forces and tendencies. This felt the wrong way round. Surely the primary reality was the living beings, and the abstract explanations are, merely, ways of conceptualizing their attributes. So, I decided to dispense with the abstractions of polarity/polar logic and start by assuming the primacy of beings. It is such beings, each, in some degree, and to some extent, alive, conscious, purposive, that already contain, inextricably, as of their ultimate nature, attributes that can be distinguished in terms of the categories of polarity. It is beings for which we assume attributes such as being infinite and indestructible, eternally self-originating and self-sustaining. Beings, in other words, are actual things, but including immaterial spiritual things, that do not need to be explained because each being has always been, and each being has essential attributes by which, as we know from our experience of ourselves and other beings, there can be change, even transformation, while remaining the same being, while retaining its eternal identity. Therefore, I define, beings as innately comprising all the needful aspects which might abstractly be considered as elements of polarity. Beings are the primary categorical assumption of my metaphysics. Beings are how the universe of reality is, and always has been, divided. To which must be added the possibility of relationships between these eternal beings, and then, I think we have a far more concrete and comprehensible scheme than Coleridge's, yet one that can equally well cause the world of intelligences with the whole system of their representations to rise up before you. Everyday Life with ST Coleridge. Bruce Charlton. I currently continue my years-long attempt, thus far, only partially successful, to get Samuel Taylor Coleridge, this time by reading the second volume, Darker Reflection, of Richard Holmes's very chunky 2-volume biography, from about 25 years ago. It is an immersive experience, since the impression given is one of an almost day-by-day account of Coleridge's moods and doings, and these were extremely various, wide-ranging and unpredictable. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was an extraordinary character, even in that age of extraordinary characters. I am currently focused on the period around 1810, when Coleridge was in his middle and late 30s. Under the impulses of his nature, and opium addiction, he mostly behaved in an utterly unreasonable and demanding manner, and yet was mostly not just tolerated but cherished. What amazes me is that Coleridge's genius was not only acknowledged, but very widely supported. At this point, Samuel Taylor Coleridge was publishing a, more or less, weekly subscription magazine called The Friend, which consisted of long, intricate, rambling essays on all sorts of fundamental questions. These issues are unreadably dense for my taste, and most people nowadays. Yet there were some hundreds of subscribers, including a couple of dozen members of Parliament, bishops, professors, and some of the most eminent of the age such as Humphrey Davy and Walter Scott. What is striking to me, is that these people were prepared to work very hard in their reading, in order to grapple with fundamental matters, when they regarded the author as a man of worthwhile insight and knowledge. This is analogous to the attitude of those who knew and supported Coleridge. They were able to discern the depth of his genius through a very unappealing but much more obvious surface of gross unreliability, a characterological inability to complete what he began, or even to begin what he had promised. I find myself impressed at their discernment of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's genius through such clouds of obscurity and chaos, and also their capacity to suffer all manner of inconveniences, rudeness and inconsideration, and letdowns, without giving up on him. By contrast with now, I am struck both by the presence of geniuses of a scale and intensity now absent, and also of a society which valued genius, and was prepared to make allowances for it. Both are needed if genius is to have a society-wide and beneficial effect. Is war good for business? Is that why it happens, now? Bruce Charlton. I am not a pacifist. Sometimes war is better than the actual alternatives, but war needs a good reason. For a Christian, looting, killing, torture, rape etc., is not a good reason, but an evil reason for war, or indeed for anything else. Those who claim that war is good for business are wrong. assuming business means the real economy, except in the trivial sense that anything may be good for somebody, in the short term. War involves getting many of your best people killed, and making lots of stuff then destroying it. That's not good economics, and can only be made to look good, for a while, by fake accounting. Specific individuals and particular groups will nearly always benefit from war, by well-known means and in well-known ways, and such people encourage starting wars, sustaining wars, and escalating wars. That is, of course, parasitic behavior. Any society that has been taken over by war parasites, profiteers, pirates, those who lust for looting, and is run for their benefit, cannot last, and does not deserve to last. Such is bad enough, and may explain much of the evil of war through history, but here and now looters do not stand at the apex of the pyramid of power. Nowadays there are those who stand behind the parasites and looters, who stand outside of nations, corporations and institutions, those who use the looters to achieve other objectives, and will discard the looters once the value has gone. What do they want from war? The answer is, they want different things at different times. For many decades up to 2020, they, mostly, wanted a single global totalitarian system based on inverted values, therefore the wars were limited and localized. But now they want a global and unlimited war, a war of mass destruction. A war in which they will sacrifice not only those who are inexpedient but also, and mainly, a war in which sacrifice is the main point. Imagine a war in which the parasites, looters, profiteers, pirates inflicted so much damage, so quickly, that they killed themselves. That is the kind of war they want. That is the kind of war they are currently working to expand. It's a tough thing to sell. Indeed, they, being small in number, and depending on the labor of others, can only sell it by deception, concealment, and gross misrepresentation of reality. But that is exactly what we now have, and to an advanced degree, at least in the West, legacy of the 2020 global coup. The system of lies, distortions and exclusions that constitutes the entirety of government, official, legal, mass media and corporate/institutional discourses, not by accident, the perfect vehicle for getting the ruling classes to destroy themselves, as well as everybody else, in a worldwide, total war. Enough changes upstream can be made to have inevitably destructive, and multiplicative, consequences downstream, such that the destruction will be unstoppable once it is triggered. And, because the institutional rulers swim, every hour of every day, in an ocean of untruthfulness, manipulation and inverted values, the world leadership class are oblivious and will never understand what they have done. Because they have embraced the inverted values of global totalitarianism, the leadership class will never realize what has been done with them and to them, never acknowledge their own complicity in great evil. As the world goes down into chaos, the leadership class, and their managerial intellectual minions, and many of the manipulated masses, will blame good for the consequences of their own evil, and will thereby unrepentantly damn themselves. Which is exactly what they most want. Because, you guessed it, they are, of course, the demons. What is the soul? William Wildblood. This is the most important question of the day, but for most people it doesn't even arise. Either they think there is no such thing as a soul, a spiritual element to their being, or else they believe their soul is who and what they feel themselves to be here and now. Something no different to their everyday personality. I would say even most religious people don't know what the soul is, especially those who don't believe it exists before birth in this world, so let me attempt a definition. The question is important because if we know what we really are, then we would know what we should be doing and where we should be going. If we don't know what we are, how can we determine the correct way to think or act, or where to direct our aspiration? The soul is the core of our being. It is that aspect of the self that is joined to the eternal and which takes us beyond the mundane and the material and imparts the sense of the sacred. It is the source of our individuality and our freedom. Without the soul, these essential elements of what it is to be human would not exist. They do not derive from matter, which is why a materialistic approach to life has no explanation for them and must, if it is to be logically consistent, which often it is not, deny they exist. The soul is a spiritual being, which is to say its natural focus is the spiritual realm, which is the plane of consciousness as it is in itself. In a sense, it is pure subjectivity, but it needs the experience of objectivity, otherwise known as duality, to bring it out of itself and enable it to grow, which means to become first aware of and then able to engage with the wider reality of God's creation, and indeed God Himself. The soul is naturally one with God, but passively so. To become aware of God and to know God in a deeper way, to consciously share in His greater being, it must externalize itself, which it does in the world where there is I and that, subject and object. The challenges it faces in such an environment give it the opportunity to grow. However, this is a process with risk attached. When the soul leaves its spiritually secure state, it is neither good nor evil. The tendency to one or the other condition is brought out by its reaction to the dualistic world. It can consciously align itself with the greater reality of God, or it can reject this reality, and become fixated on itself. This goes deeper than simple belief. I call it the orientation of the heart. It is a matter of feeling. Not emotion, which is based on personal reaction to stimuli, but innate response to spiritual reality, a kind of answering resonance of the self to God. This should make clear that true religion is not following a set of rules or teachings, but the positive opening of the heart to the higher spiritual power, higher because there are many forces in the universe, but we are talking about the Creator, not anything in creation. The Masters told me that the greater part of you remains with us. This implies that only an aspect of the soul takes earthly incarnation. The soul is more than the earthly personality, which is its representative in three-dimensional existence, but the two are intimately linked, forming a whole. What one does impacts the other, even if only a fraction of the totality of what the soul is manifests in our ordinary existence. It is the soul that evolves, which means unfolds its spiritual potential, but it does so by means of the earthly personality and what it experiences and expresses in this world. There is a symbiotic relationship between the two, and although ultimately only the soul remains, it is colored by the personality which, as it were, eventually dissolves into it as sugar might do into tea. The wise do not identify themselves with their personality, but do not reject it either. It is part of the totality of their being, but not the central core. That remains the soul. Of course, there are spiritual states even beyond the soul, though to differentiate between the two I would call these higher states divine. We are called to conjoin our soul with these higher states in divine union, but even when that takes place our individuality remains what it is. Expanded, deepened, divinized, but still the soul. We made the wrong choice concerning freedom and love. Francis Berger. I have written many blog posts about the anti-God, anti-creation, demonically led establishment and its system, but it would be an error to assume that they are solely to blame for the malevolent and putrid conditions of our time and place. Don't get me wrong, they are certainly the drivers of our current spiritual malaise, but they could not have done it, could not be doing it, without the active, willing, and submissive compliance of the vast majority of the West. Put bluntly, the majority of the West actively chose, is actively choosing, to participate in the anti-God, anti-creation, demonically led agenda. Why? 2 words, freedom and love. People in the West turned their backs on freedom and love that aligns with God and creation and embraced the pseudo, anti-God, anti-creation freedom and love the establishment promulgates. We chose this. It really is that simple. To underscore this undesirable fact, I turn to the current American ambassador to Hungary, a gay, Jewish human rights lawyer who demonstrated his respect for Hungary's support of traditional family values by arriving in Budapest with his husband and kids in tow, and the recent speech he gave to celebrate Pride Month. Pay attention, because everything this man says is on point.
Hungarians are fiercely independent, sophisticated, and intelligent people, and rightfully proud of their rich culture and history. No matter how many government-produced posters of Brussels bombs may be emblazoned around town at any given moment, the reality is Hungary is not under attack by outside forces, or vulnerable to a liberal virus or Western decadence, or cowering before George Soros, or at the mercy of omnipotent conspiratorial powers. No, the reality is something far simpler. The story of Hungary, including its movement for equality, is one being written not by foreigners, but by Hungarians. Not by them, but by you. Not by people abroad, but by the people in this room. It is not fictional. It is a true story that is rich, resonant, and real. And the United States supports you as you write that story, and in your effort to advance human dignity. While the news should report this truthful story factually, I can already read the headlines Minister Rogan's team is dictating for tomorrow's papers. No doubt I'll be accused of staging provocations, of importing Western wokeness, and foisting obscene values while meddling in Hungary's domestic affairs. What won't happen is any of the government's captured and controlled media outlets printing this speech in full. What they'll cut out, what they always cut out, is the fact that it is Hungarians who believe in these universal human rights, and it is Hungarians leading the fight for them. What they'll cut out is all of you. But they should print this speech because tonight is different. While the government-controlled media would have you believe these topics are all I talk about, in fact, this is the first speech I have given here on LGBT rights. As I approach my one-year anniversary here, having spent much of the year focusing on other issues of strategic importance to our two countries, they should print what I am actually saying about this topic rather than what they portray. They should print it in full. I dare them. But no matter what the government-controlled media will or will not print, no matter what it does or does not say, it cannot distract from one simple, undeniable fact: Hungary made its choice. Hungary chose to be part of the West. It is Hungary and Hungarians who chose to join the US, the Council of Europe, and the European Union and to uphold their bedrock principles. It is Hungary and Hungarians who chose, 25 years ago next year, to join NATO, and who pledged to uphold our shared security as part of a community of democratic values. It is Hungary and Hungarians who in 2003, 20 years ago, passed the Act on Equal Treatment and the Promotion of Equal Opportunities, which forbids discrimination, including on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. In short, Hungary made a choice, and it is a choice Hungarians should be proud of, and most are, and a choice that should be honored. A firm, unequivocal, and prideful declaration of Hungary's identity and place, in Europe, in NATO, in the West. A choice to move away from an era of oppression and repression, and towards an era of freedom and, dare I say, love.
Sobochog Ace Serilim. Freedom and love. You can replace Hungary and Hungarians with any other nation or nationality in the West in the text above and the message remains the same. The same applies to the pronoun we. We chose this freedom and love. We. It was our choice. We must stop pretending otherwise. The only way forward is repentance and, if possible, resistance. But repentance and resistance are not enough. We need to actively and willingly reject the establishment's freedom and love and align with real freedom and love. We need to make the choice for real freedom and love and commit to this choice, eternally. Simple, yet tough. Note added, when the ambassador is not pushing freedom and love, he pours his energies into berating Hungary for not being more involved in the freedom and love war against Vodka land. Further note added, my criticism of the ambassador should not be taken as an automatic endorsement of the current Hungarian government who, despite being on the right side on some issues, is most definitely on the wrong side overall. The Paradox of History in Christianity. Bruce Charlton. Christianity is a religion rooted in history. It depends on the reality that Jesus was born, died, resurrected, ascended, and necessarily in some place and time. Although what Jesus does not, it seems to me, hinge upon him being born in any particular place or time, these things must have happened, and during human history. Therefore, Christianity cannot be, as apparently Buddhism is, at least, to Western scholars, almost indifferent to whether any particular Buddha ever existed at all any actual point of history. Or whether that Buddha is instead merely a vehicle for education, a story pointing at truth, the symbolic exemplification of a particular teaching. Yet, although Jesus must be historical, on the other hand he should not be primarily historical. It is a snare when Christians become so fixed upon the historical aspects of Christianity, that they become slaves to the academic historical disciplines, comparative study of ancient languages, the study of ancient texts, archaeology, etc. This is not a solid basis for faith, as evidenced by the fact that Christian churches have declined and collapsed over the past couple of centuries, while Christian scholarship has waxed, and accumulated vast amounts of contextual evidence and interpretative sophistication. Christianity, it seems to me, needs to be rooted in personal interaction between the individual and Jesus Christ. This means that a Christianity that depends on academic historical knowledge is at second hand, just as a Christianity rooted in obedience to a church is second hand, or a Christianity rooted in adherence to tradition is second hand. This despite the potentially great value of such secondary supports and knowledge bases. The root needs to be personal. What we seem to end up with is the paradox that Christianity cannot be derived from any kind of history, but neither can Christianity be something essentially symbolic, that is, subjectively created, like a poem. But paradox indicates that we have asked the wrong question, or made false assumptions. In this case we have assumed a too restricted understanding of knowledge sources, and of history. We have conflated the secondary social and the primary personal. Conflated the business of attaining and enforcing scholarly consensus by agreeing upon a limited and simplified models and approved methods, by professional training and accreditation etc., all of which social institutions and mechanisms can be, and have been, corrupted to anti-Christian aims. And we are mixing this up with the qualitatively different matter of achieving a strong, adequately true and accurate, and sufficiently stable, personal faith that we may live by. In other words, the paradox of history in Christianity points us at the need to consider an altogether other form of knowing the past, a different way of getting historical knowledge that is neither symbolic nor academic. It is a way of knowing that is objective in the sense that it regards the history of Jesus as real, happening in a real place and time, and also subjective in the sense that this knowledge is derived from personal, and spiritual, ways of knowing. In sum, I think we each need to seek whatever historical knowledge is necessary, primarily by personal endeavor and from the guidance of the Holy Ghost, by direct knowing, mind to mind. Often by formulating our own ideas, using whatever sources we regard as authoritative, and we can discover and grasp sufficiently, and seeking for intuitive divine endorsement of those ideas. This is, of course, a trial and error process, since it depends on our own capacities and is affected by our own motivations. Nonetheless, if we are genuinely seeking the truth, we will, by living personal interaction with the Holy Ghost, by the divine within each of us, be guided through our own errors, will zigzag to sufficient truth for our purposes. How did Karl Popper's open society attack on totalitarianism itself become totalitarian? Bruce Charlton. I only know of Karl Popper's book The Open Society and Its Enemies at second hand, initially from Popper by Brian McGee, 1974, and from references in Popper's autobiography which I read aged 19, and in many other places. I never read the big book itself, because, for most of my adult life, I already knew I would agree with it, and there seemed no point. The basic idea is that societies must be, like science a century ago, open to dissent, indeed encouraging of all debate, and thereby error can be corrected, and a closer approach to the truth can be discovered. Yet there can never be a positive formulation of truth, exception provisionally, for further evaluation, so societies must always remain open. The notion was one of a dynamic society, always questing, always critical, always self-correcting, always hypothetical, never dogmatic. I never revised my positive attitude to the open society until after I became a Christian. However, in the early 2000s I was rereading Popper's ideas, and became aware that their major supporter was a chap called George Soros+, who funded specific people, one of whom was a colleague, organizations, publications promoting the open society. What a helpful chap. George Soros was supporting the autonomy of civil society, protecting freedom of expression, encouraging a free interaction of arguments, and so on. Yes, that's George Soros. So, how did Popper's open society ideas, apparently formulated specifically to explain why early 20th century totalitarianism was morally wrong and intellectually bankrupt, end up by seamlessly evolving into a primary rationalization for a global totalitarianism of greater scope and thoroughness than ever was achieved before? I think the reason is simple, which is that the open society is a godless ideology, a secular and atheistic society, promoted by those who have abandoned their religion, which therefore is all about means and nothing about ends. Indeed, the open society idea tries to make a virtue of its own deficiencies, by claiming that only a life, society and world based upon process merely is genuinely good. Goodness has been redefined as process. Any idea that there is a good that ought to be pursued by various means, is declared totalitarian. It is replaced by the idea that good inheres in the means, good is whatever results from the proper process. And the proper process? Well, articulated as such, the open society is now a universal rationalization for the direction and content of official modernity, however that is currently defined. Nowadays, justice is whatever results from the legal process, regardless of the corrupt actualities of that process. Education is whatever happens at officially validated schools and colleges. Quality is whatever emanates from quality-assured, auditable, management systems. Democracy is whatever emanates from the actual system of voting, including whatever latest corruptions and disregarding all propaganda and ideological coercion, and whatever comes from the democratically elected government is therefore good. Science is whatever professional and accredited scientists are saying today. In a nutshell, the open society is a philosophical justification for the system is always right. It turns out that, lacking God or any roots in the spiritual, the openness of an open society can be redefined into its opposite. Why not? So long as the society, the system, continues to declare itself open, then it is said to be superior to others that are based on ideas of truth being separable from process. If the open society is wrong now, is revealed as evil and totalitarian, then maybe it always was intended thus, maybe it was engineered, under demonic influence, as a stalking horse against God, divine creation and the good. That is suggested by the obvious fact that those who adhered to these liberal ideas so very seldom jumped the ship and blew the whistle, when openness became ever more obviously closed censorship, exclusion of dissent, and micro-control of mass thought and behavior. And, because no good was allowed to be distinguishable from a proved process, because goodness was held to inhere in the system itself, all this vast apparatus of totalitarian control was routinely deployed against whatever was true, dutiful or virtuous. As we may see all around. The flaw was always there, when Popper talked of the need to be illiberal in defense of liberal ideas, intolerant of intolerance, yet neglected that he had abolished all criteria for knowing the truth or the good. Liberalism was unrooted, set adrift, open to endless redefinitions in light of the expediency of the current system protecting itself. Anyway, the fate of Popper's open society over the past century is a case history of the way in which, like zombies, ideas and ideals, as well as persons and institutions, can be, have already been, subverted, killed, hollowed out, and replaced with their opposites. In other words, an inverted world, of inverted values, where open means closed, freedom means omni-surveillance and micro-control, and where the open society is a ruthless, worldwide, oligarchical, piratical looting dictatorship. This links with Popper's falsification idea of science, whereby, supposedly, an hypothesis can never be proved, but can be refuted. Science can demonstrate wrongness, but not rightness. This concept of science is, if taken seriously, a vast negation of knowledge, as science moves from error to error, based on hypotheses that have not yet been disproved, but maybe at some future point. It also removes the individual scientist's personal motivations, ability and truthfulness from consideration, because science is the process, not the person. In other words, this is writing a blank check for corruption and dishonesty in science. By Popper's account, this makes science into an open society in miniature, the first such, and the most highly developed. Yet, science too is now a closed society. While continuing to pay loud and continuous lip service to the same ideals of a century ago, science now is in actuality a merely branch office of the totalitarian bureaucracy, like everything else, its role merely to manufacture rationalizations for whatever the global leadership class currently want to do. God as all or nothing. Francis Berger. I don't believe in the classical abstract conceptualization of the omnigod, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent, and so forth, but my disbelief does not entail that God is nothing. Those who adhere to the omnigod conceptualization approach God from an all-or-nothing perspective. God is either omni, or he is not a God at all. Moreover, they accuse those who do not accept the omnigod idea of committing a category error stemming from anthropomorphism. God is God, and man is man. One is the supreme, absolute, self-sufficient creator capable of anything, the other is a mere creature, finite, mortal, utterly contingent, with limited capabilities. Considering these two disparate natures, it is readily evident that God and man are not and cannot be in the same category of being. Furthermore, those who suggest that God and man are in the same category think far too highly of man and far too little of God. Non-omni-God is just hyper-anthropomorphism, excessive projection of human traits and characteristics onto the divine. Those who subscribe to omnigod theology declare that only omnigod is worthy of worship. Put another way, if God is not omni in every conceivable way, he is just a being among beings and essentially unworthy of reverence, devotion, exaltation, praise, etc. If he is just a being among beings, he cannot expect us to obey him or feel duty-bound to him. Nor can he expect us to love him. If God is not omni, he cannot command such things and should not expect to receive such things from us. Omnigod believers accuse those who do not believe in the omnigod philosophy of errant, arrogant, hubristic anthropomorphism that elevates man far beyond his station in creation. However, they rarely stop to consider that their vehement refusal to consider relations with a non-omni God might mark the very pinnacle of human error, arrogance, and hubris. Being a Christian, if it's so simple, why is it so difficult? Bruce Charlton. Being a Christian is clearly very difficult in the West in 2023, because, apparently, extremely few people seem to be doing it. Yet it must also be extremely simple. Why do I say it must be simple to be a Christian? Because we know that God is the Creator, who makes the world around us, and also that He is our Father, and loves each of us, as His child. Such a God would obviously both want and be able to make it simple to do what was necessary to follow Jesus Christ to salvation. Simple enough for children, for simple people, for weak people living in evil environments. And simple enough to happen in just a moment, as often depicted in the Gospels. So why is it so difficult, nowadays? One reason is that Christianity is too simple, which puts of those who have pretensions to intellectuality, and that means a lot of people nowadays. A simple answer is regarded as facile, for modern men, simple equals simplistic. Another is that resurrection into heaven seems obviously too good to be true. Generations of propaganda have made people assume that the truth is we are meaningless accidents in a purposeless universe, so any positive view of life must be merely wishful thinking or delusion. Another is that Christianity is first and foremost not of this world, it is directed at resurrection after death, whereas most people regard death as a final annihilation, and therefore seek, above all, to change their own lives and the world for the better. Given that becoming a Christian leads to a loss of status in Western nations, the outcome for a new Christian, and all real Christians must sooner or later be new, is usually that of making his own life immediately less esteemed and less successful. Furthermore, and more deeply, becoming a Western Christian in 2023 is active and participative, we ourselves have to do most of the work. Whereas, what people mostly want, especially modern Western people, is to be overwhelmed by reality. Indeed, for most people, reality just is that which most strongly overwhelms us. People expect to be overwhelmed by Christianity like they might be overwhelmed by a blockbuster movie, or a media-stoked frenzy, or a multi-pronged propaganda campaign. Whereas, to become a Christian 2023, entails ignoring all that is most culturally overwhelming, and making a solo decision, perhaps without social encouragement or support, indeed, quite the opposite, making up one's own mind by going against what mainstream opinions regards as the evidence or good reasons, and taking full responsibility for one's beliefs and behavioral ideals in a situation where even the self-identified Christian churches are urging different things. These are just some of the reasons why being a Christian in 2023 is so very difficult, even though it is also so very simple. Following Jesus Christ offers something different from either this worldly, or next worldly religion. Bruce Charlton. One of the problems throughout the history of Christianity has been that it has sometimes been framed as this worldly, and sometimes as next worldly, maybe sometimes some halfway house compromise, whereas it is actually neither. This third thing is not, of itself, difficult to understand, except that people will not give up pre-existing categories of either / or, of what they already think Christianity is. The two ways of doing this came under categories of complete acceptance of, and immersion in, this world, or the complete rejection of this world as merely illusion, merely sin. Obviously, the mainstream modern materialist way is complete and exclusive acceptance of this world, the attempt to maximize pleasure and eliminate suffering, and total rejection of everything spiritual. But there is also an allowed, and to some extent encouraged, backup, which is the permissible oneness spirituality, that has been Western manufactured from elements of Hinduism and Buddhism. This aims an annihilation of all separateness, all ego and thinking, reabsorption into the abstract and impersonal divine, as much as possible during this life, by meditation, and wholly after death. Christianity, by contrast, is about following Jesus Christ through death, to resurrection and heaven. Resurrection, heaven and Jesus are all regarded as involving actual individual, free, agent, persons, and the ideal destination and state is loving and personal relationships, on earth and in heaven. With Christianity, those who choose salvation will remain themselves, eternally. Why is this so difficult to grasp? Why do so many people try to stuff Christianity into just this world or abstract otherworld boxes? Simply, but profoundly, because the metaphysical assumptions of modern man regard the personal as only this worldly, hence time-bound, changeable, always being corrupted toward a death which is annihilation of the self. The options for someone with such fundamental assumptions about reality are therefore either consciously choosing to accept the actuality of change and corruption, that is sin, which means denying any fundamental difference between sin and virtue, or else to yearn for a permanent escape from change and corruption that can only be into the unconscious, impersonal, the abstract, the timeless, entailing the loss of that which makes us persons. This explains why modern materialism can comfortably coexist with oneness spirituality, the one accepts, the other desires, annihilation of the self. And why, in practice, the advocates of otherworldly oneness spirituality are typically eagerly on board with the primary strategies of this worldly totalitarianism. Time to die. Don't envy those whose main aim is survival. Their punishment will be if they get what they want. Charlton. So often in life, the worst punishment that anyone can be given, is when they get what they want. This, because, very often, what we want derives from sinful and unrepented desires. If we actually get it, then we will also get the inevitable consequences, inner spiritual and outer natural, of embracing sin. This applies equally, and for the same basic reason, to the child who wants to live on sweets, the adolescent who wants vast quantities and variety of sex, the adult who wants high status, massive wealth, and real power. The global totalitarian leadership class seem most to want giga-death for the masses, and survival for themselves, not their family descendants, of which they often have none, indeed, some kind of this worldly everlastingly extended life. Such appears to be a major motive behind their relentless activity, such is apparently what is planned, with some degree of secrecy. Since those who read this are likely to be among the planned to be destroyed masses, as are most of those who regard themselves as exempted, it is tempting to feel jealous of those whose survival is organized. Maybe we even want to join them in surviving through to their brave new world, but hoping to set up a society more to our taste, in some unnoticed corner exempted from their rule, and where they will leave us unmolested. A time will come to every man when it is time to die, and when that time arrives, he will know it. The way things are shaping, such a time will, probably soon, come to a very large number of people over a short time scale. When that time comes, we ought not fight for survival, but fight to do what is right, which we will also know, at the time. Survival then becomes a temptation, and there will be many specious arguments as to why my survival, for at least a bit longer, will seem like a good and necessary thing, despite that we know the proper time has come to put our survival as a lower priority than what is needed. Therefore it is a bad habit to develop a primary concern with survival. We all die, sooner or later, and for a follower of Christ, that is a good thing, when it happens at the right time, despite the ineradicably tragic impact of mortal death. Most of us, me included, would do well to think more about the inevitability and ultimate rewards of death, and that therefore discerning and embracing our own time to die is a great gift, as well as a profound challenge. Stanley Messenger on distinguishing healthly from unhealthly psychic experiences. Bruce Charlton.
Daily inner life for the majority of Westerners is nowadays little more than a lonely, restless chat show. Apart from those who simply talk to themselves all day, there are many whose inner lives are numbly silent till someone addresses them. Then there is a minority who pray, and a still smaller number who meditate. Of those, a tiny number reach a level of mystical contemplation, or, on a different path, give themselves over to some degree of trance mediumship. In recent years there has been an increase in a kind of inner life which differs from these in a significant way. In these situations a person's focus of identity, the groundedness at the center of their own consciousness, is not only not weakened or disturbed, it is on the contrary considerably strengthened and enhanced. By natural endowment, or more frequently by a degree of more or less conscious self-training, often through meditation or kindred practices, normal consciousness has been expanded and enhanced. The experience is that the person feels there is more inner space. Within this space all kinds of imaginative exercises can take place. Different people have different talents in this regard. Some are more easily able to visualize inner events. Some have more facility in hearing them. Others again have the facility for constructing a framework for other conscious presences to occupy. People's experiences are almost infinitely varied in this regard. Some people remember their awareness of other entities in their inner world since early childhood, often lost as they grow older. Others construct inner worlds which are in the first place almost wholly imaginary, and only gradually become occupied with thoughts and pictures in later life which are recognizably derived from other realities. The great difference between genuine, healthy psychic experience and the pathological situations described above is that the healthy experiences are always in control. Even when quite unfamiliar expansions take place, they always do so from within. It is the self-awareness which grows, and the self-awareness which contains the expansion. One never has the sense of losing touch. Moreover, everything is experienced as being under the protection of love. This inner love is the crucial yardstick. In pathological conditions there is always an underlying uneasiness and fear.
Excerpted and edited from Dancing with Tears, by Stanley Messenger, 1999. Stanley Messenger, 1917–2013, was a scholar of Rudolf Steiner, whose explanations I often find to be clearer and more memorable than those of his master. He also gave special attention to this question of what might be termed occult, psychic or clairvoyant experiences, and how these had been changed by the evolutionary development of Western man's consciousness, and especially in the period approaching and following the millennium. Unsurprisingly, unlike Steiner himself in this regard, Stanley M. was not able fully to live up to his own peak level of understanding, and often lapsed back into seeking and overvaluing exactly the kind of spiritual experiences that, elsewhere, he so lucidly had explained were dubious and prone to mislead. Nonetheless, explanations like that above are very helpful in understanding the kind of thing we ought to be aiming for, the kind of thing I have, in different words, variously tried to formulate as primary thinking/heart thinking/direct knowing, or Owen Barfield's concept of final participation. Whereas spiritual experiences of the past tended to be approached by striving for an opening of the mind, a passive acceptance of, and being overwhelmed by, perceptual information, seeing visions and hearing words, having conversations. What Stanley M. is describing could, by contrast, be regarded as conscious and actively experienced throughout, and not perceptual, but instead directly known in our thinking. Instead of being overwhelmed by the experience, such as happens in trance mediumship, or automatic writing, the participant retains a sense of full control of a process of thinking that is quantitatively, even qualitatively, strengthened and increased in scope and surety, compared with normal thinking. And while past experiences were often sought for practical and functional purposes, the newer experiences will only happen under the protection of love, which I take to mean that love, not curiosity, not usefulness, not power, for instance, must be the motivation. The main problem with the new kind of psychic experiences is that of wishful thinking. This temptation is, to some extent, avoidable by being aware of false motivations such as ego or advantage, and by refraining from learning material for the purposes of teaching, or to order, for example in groups convened at a particular time and place for the purpose. This is one of the areas in which I think Stanley M. went wrong, as you may see from reading more of the Dances with Tears booklet. He describes working for many years with a group, dedicated to making contact with spiritual beings, aiming to collecting detailed information from such beings on specified topics, and engaging in lecturing, workshop, and writing projects in order to disseminate the resulting material. The result was mostly made-up wishful thinking, in line with the group's pre-existing beliefs and prejudices, and in conformity with too credulously accepted, mainstream New Age output of that era, 1980s and 90s. The genuine, valid spiritual teaching was mostly swamped by the sheer volume of personality-level, socially shaped stuff. Indeed, in a lecture, Stanley M. acknowledged that he had been told that only about 5% of the material he got was genuinely from the supposed communicating entity, viz. the Archangel Michael, the other 95% from himself. While Stanley felt that even 5% of spiritual truth was valuable, my feeling is that the amount of conceptual distortion with so much personal invention is so great that it is, in practice, impossible to filter out the truly factual 5%. At any rate, what he and his group got by such means seems, as with the similar case of Steiner, to be mostly wrong, in many, very misleading, ways. My strong feeling is that it would be much preferable to have only the 5% that is valid, and be content with a small volume of relatively simple information, than to build all sorts of castles in the air, on subjects like UFOs and crop circles, and an impending mass spiritual awakening, from great swathes of wishful thinking, exacerbated, not corrected, by consensus group dynamics. Nonetheless, with these caveats, I am confident that Stanley Messenger had much wisdom to impart concerning the principles of what is most needed here and now. And if he did not personally live up to the highest levels of his aspirations, and was tripped up by his own need for spiritual excitement, and a desire for feeling incremental spiritual progress, then so are we, all of us, unable to stay at our own best levels at all times. As always, the material needs to be explored in a discriminating fashion, and with properly loving motivation, if the good and valid it genuinely includes, is to be sifted from the wishful thinking, misleading, and irrelevant material. The Gnostic Tar. Francis Berger. Gnosticism has become a fashionable tarring tactic among some Christian bloggers. An efficient means to neatly, albeit restrictively and inaccurately, categorize the views of another. Gnostic not only brands, it also condemns. How convenient. Disagree with something a Christian has expressed somewhere. Easy solution, call it Gnosticism. Confused or unsettled by the metaphysical assumptions a Christian has disclosed. Simple, write it off as Gnosticism. Unhappy with the Christianity a Christian espouses, piece of cake, label the Christian a Gnostic. Great pigeonholing tactic there. What's next? Resort to terms like racist and transphobe. To all those who enthusiastically sling the Gnostic tar, I offer the following humble advice: up your game, seriously. The Omnipotence of God. William Wildblood. Is God all-powerful or not? If he is, why does he not intervene in human affairs more or even at all? If he is not, can he really be considered a proper God, capital G type God? I understand the arguments on both sides but would like to offer my take which potentially reconciles them. Here we go. Let's start with the basic argument in favor of a supreme creator, the one without a second from whom all things derive. This is an intellectual argument which is fine, though it is not the point from which I would personally start. That would be intuitive, or from the point of direct knowing. This, however, cannot be shared and could be seen as open to error through wishful thinking or some other kind of mental/emotional distortion. When all is said and done, we take the subjective route in matters of belief, but in sharing our beliefs an objective stance, as in one deriving from reason and logic, is usually more persuasive. So, here is the classic argument in favor of God. Everything that exists has a cause, but there must ultimately be something that is the cause of everything else, a causeless cause, or the process could not get started. Something has to kick everything else off and be the ground from which everything else grows. No uncaused first cause means no nothing. Literally. There cannot be anything, but there cannot be nothing either, as nothing implies an absence, but there can't be absence unless there is presence to begin with. What would there be if there wasn't anything? Don't go there. This something cannot be reliant on anything else, or it would be an effect and therefore not the first cause. It must be absolutely self-sufficient. It cannot be limited because there is nothing that could limit it, everything else deriving from it itself and subordinate to it. Not being limitable means it is all-powerful. It is not has, being consciousness or timeless awareness, existing in total self-sufficiency on a formless level, form being something that comes about along with time and space as the structure for creation. It must be being consciousness, because otherwise there could be neither being nor consciousness deriving from it. Properly trained theologians could develop this train of thought more thoroughly, and they have done so. The point I wish to make here, though, is that this line of thought affirms the omnipotence of God, given that He is the cause, ground, root, source and fountainhead of everything else. He is the creator, and this universe is His creation. He can change any part of it at any moment by a thought. Or, at least, He could do that if He had not renounced some of His power. And this is precisely what He has done. In creating individual creatures with free will, God has given up power. He must do this, or we could not have free will. If He could intervene as and when He felt like it, our free will would be a mockery, something that could go so far but no further. Conditional free will is not properly free. It is true that the rules of the universe which God has set up do not allow for unlimited expression of free will. If it is exercised against creation, there will be consequences, call it karma, reaping what you sow or whatever. But that is a different thing. There may be consequences of free will exercised in the wrong way, but our freedom in itself is still sacrosanct, never overridden. God gives part of His creation, maybe all of His creation eventually, free will for two reasons. The first is love. For love really to be, it must be free. Constrained love, necessary love, automatic love. It makes no sense. Only creatures with free will can love, and only they can be loved in the highest, most rewarding sense. The second reason is that this makes creation more interesting for God. If His creatures start creating themselves, that will make creation come alive for God. That may sound naive, absurd even, but think of a universe endlessly expanding from within, one that is dynamic, free, without regular or predictable pattern, with a bit of grit in it that makes pearls. That is so much more creatively exciting than a clockwork universe. Human free will is like the little lack of balance that can take creation in intriguing and unpredictable new directions. You might think that nothing is unpredictable to God, but even if He sees everything at one time, it is still new to Him as He sees it. If it doesn't come directly from Him, then even if He sees it before it happens from our limited perspective, it is still new to Him. Human freedom can be bad as well as good. Giving us free will is a huge risk. If we exercise this will in accordance with the laws of God and creation, then the sky's the limit, but if we go against those laws, then we become creatively destructive. It's not hard to see what the tendency is at the moment, and it may be that there is a fail-safe device installed in creation that will not let the process go too far. Myth and religious tradition tell us that is exactly what has happened in the past. But for God, the potential gain is worth the risk, because a universe without freedom would be a semi-dead universe. Here then is my conclusion. God, or the creative mind behind everything, is omnipotent, but he renounces some of his power to give it to us in the form of free will. Now, this leads on to an important point. In the past, human beings have accepted the omnipotence of God, and this has often led to varying degrees of fatalism. We just have to accept God's will. But what if God wants partners rather than servants? Partners who can work with him in making creation more magnificent instead of workers whose only function is to maintain it. This means that we have to accept our power and use it wisely. As potential co-creators, we are called to work with God but not for him. Certainly, we work according to the laws of creation and under the overall headship of God, with life rather than against it, so our work is loving cooperation as opposed to individualism. A core spiritual teaching is be individual but not individualistic. But God gave us power so that we could exercise it and work alongside him. This is where we are now, and where the changes in consciousness that have come about over the last few centuries should be taking us. At the moment, our heightened sense of individuality has brought more evil than good as it is working out on the material plane. But as we evolve, it may be that it will begin to transfer itself, in some of us anyway, to the spiritual plane, and then God's transference of power to mankind will start to bear good fruit.